Okay, I think I start, and I mean, this is anyways recorded. So good afternoon to our 5th launch event of the Routledge Handbook of EU-Middle East Relations in the framework also of the Jean-Monnet network MENA. In today's session, we are turning to development, trade, and migration. So while in the previous sessions, we looked into the history of this relationship, into evolving theory on EU-Middle East relations, into political developments, and also into security, conflict, and peace. Today, we are turning to what we can maybe call the economic and social fabric of this relationship, so economic and social connectivities, which are, however, dominated by a strong imbalance and power asymmetry. We will first have about 45 minutes of presentations for the 3 book contributions, followed by questions and answers. And to the audience, you can post questions during the presentations in the chat box right away, and I picked them up in the question and answer session. We will also register this event and put it online, as we get many requests to watch this also afterwards, and it is part of the EU-MENA catalog of lectures, which is in open access and can so be used by everyone. So I will briefly present the panelists respectively before they speak, but very briefly because you can find their longer bios on the EACEA homepage of this event series. Emma Murphy and her book chapter on Europe and Middle East youth cannot be with us today, unfortunately. So first, we are starting with the book chapter of Emile Badarin and Jeremy Wildeman, which is titled Aid, Security and Fortress Europe, EU Development Aid in the Middle East and North Africa. Emile Badarin is a research fellow at the European Neighborhood Policy Chair at the College of European in Natolin. Jeremy Wildeman is a fellow at the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa and the Center for the Study of Democracy and Diversity at Queen's University. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. Do you hear me? It's all good? Okay, great. Anyway, if I go over time, stop me, so don't feel anything. Thank you for inviting us for this event. I just save the time and go straight into the topic. The chapter talks about aid, where we situate the whole question somewhere between direct European colonial past and its indirect or informal colonial present that we are dealing with today. Some scholars call this relationship coloniality. We can talk about that if you want later on. So formal colonialism laid the foundations of the current deeply unbalanced relationship between Europe and the Middle East. And then when I talk about the Middle East, I mean the entire, like whatever you call here as the Middle East, Northern Africa, I mean the Arab world. That's how we in the Middle East refer to the Middle East as the Middle East. As a starting point, the EU prides itself of being the largest aid donor in the world, and that's partially true. And I say partially for a reason. But why is aid so central to the EU and in the global South? And that's basically the question that the chapter tries to answer. And in order to get an idea of why this is the case, we need to look at the history of the present relationship between Europe, or the EU in this case, and non-Europe on a bigger scale, or what is called the global South. So in the last 500 years, 5 centuries, racialized differentiations between the European and the non-European is so fundamental to to the current relationship between Europe, or the EU, and the Middle East. Domination and transformation of the non-European subject, space, and geography, and so on, and history, are in different ways predicated upon this binary distinction between Europe, where Europe established itself as the center and the sovereign, the civilized, the enlightened, whatever you want, and anything else is quite the opposite, the periphery, the non-sovereign, and so on. Now, I hope you started to get a sense where this leads us, this discussion, where this takes us. The present-day EU liberal and normative discourse and programs, the economic programs, preside on this narrative, on the narrative of enlightenment and progress, and on being a civilizational power. Now we call it normative power Europe. So we just changed civilization to normative, but the content is pretty much the same. Although officially we have a post-colonial world, officially that's the case, we still think in imperial and colonial concepts and vocabularies. Give you examples such as the ideas that we use: reformation, structural adjustment, development, democratization, free market or open door policy. All of these terms are deeply, deeply colonial. Since states in the global south are formally sovereign entities, although this sovereignty is compromised, the EU, with the active involvement of its colonial, like former colonial powers such as France or Germany or the UK until they left, is still oriented by the spirit of the mandate system of the early 20th century that was imposed on the Middle East and lots of African countries in order to bring them to maturity and enlightenment and be independent. So the economic system of that mandate era still in many ways orient how the EU deals with the Middle East. So here we have a shift in that system, a shift from the racial, let's say, discourse to economics, which is still based on racialized ideas. Economy sounds, it has an appeal, a universal appeal. It sounds more universal, which is not universal economy. What is used here is a specific version of economics, specific version of markets. Markets existed all around the world or throughout history. But what we are dealing with is the neoliberal or liberal kind of economy. That is, that's the basis of this system. Even though in reality it still produces coloniality and racism, but with a good face, and allows the adjustment of the domestic affairs in these countries in the Middle East and the global South more broadly. And here economy is a key instrument in the matrix of power and control, and that's where aid plays a role. And it's only a little instrument. This aid thing that's in the EU budget or whatever, in EU programs, it's only one little instrument out of a dense network of economic power that has been utilized to induce transformation in the Middle East or the entire region and beyond it. The crucial point is that Europe becomes the standard, and anything else and everything else beyond it must be modeled on it. As the EU says itself, this economy stuff is only an instrument. It has a utilitarian purpose in order to first transform the non-European people and non-European spaces and bring them to the fold, and embed the European contingent interests, values, vision, whatever you wanted, into the legal fabric and the political fabrics and the ethics of these countries where these interventions occur. And often this happens in ex-colonies, racialized spaces. And here indeed, the imperial doctrine, and that's the core point here, of reformation and transformation of the subjectivity, the ecology, the geography of the Middle East in particular, and the whole global South more generally, continues to orient the present-day European policy, aid policy or economics, as it did during the age of empire. And this happens under different forms and under different titles. Now it is called development, progress, good governance, state building, whatever, or resilience building. That's the latest. There might be other stuff coming. You never know. The idea is that these others are always lacking. They need always the EU guidance to be developed and enhanced and so on. Aid or any other economic instrument which serves only as a means to carry out this doctrine of transformation, that's the core point here, are so ingrained in EU's founding documents. And we can see that in the Treaty of Rome or any other related aid frameworks. They were signed with the ex-colonies in the 60s and 70s, and still we still have them today. As well as the more recent geopolitical frameworks, such as the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership in the mid-90s, and then we have the ENP, the European Neighborhood Policy, and the intricate network of financial instruments that are attached to these frameworks. These are all part of this economic power that the EU uses to transform these areas. So these frameworks have maintained and normalized a colonial matrix of power, but this time through soft or economic power, without the exclusion of military intervention when necessary by member states. And we have seen that all the time, like you see what happened in Libya. So as you can see here, economic aid is entwined with a specific geopolitical structuring and way of thinking. Aid is used to transform not only the people's behavior, but also their geography by providing a one-way interception of the relatively fixed borders between the EU and the Middle East. And this creates a semblance of multilateralism or a semblance of dialogue or whatever, which is predicated upon deeply asymmetric power relations between the EU as a unified actors and the many others as divided southern so-called neighbors or who happen to be living in our European neighborhood. That's why it's called the neighborhood policy, and with all the aid that comes with it. So the territory in this sense is framed as European, but not the people. And that's the major point here. The logic is simple. Since it is our neighborhood, then our terms and conditions apply. So by the use of aid to fund EU projects abroad, the whole region with its diverse population and rich history and civilizations becomes again a European sphere of influence. The EU try not to use that. That's why they use other terms to create this geography around it. So it doesn't appear as having the colonial legacy with it. In this sense, aid and development aid takes us back to the colonial matrix of power, to the colonial dictionary, and allows the EU to go into the interior of this sphere of influence to transform it. The EU, in this regard, regularly reproduces the same imperial mechanism of transformation through seemingly novel principles, such as incentive-based approach, or more for more, means more money in return for self-reformation and adopting certain codes of in these countries. And this gets me to the provocative point, which I would like to highlight, that colonialism, whether it's formal or informal, direct or indirect, is not just about exploitation. Exploitation actually comes afterwards, but it's also about elimination, either physical elimination, moral, cultural, ecological, or institutional. And aid, in my view, cover the last one is it seeks in a way to supplant the native institutions, ways of governance, and their systems of value, and through disciplining them into another way of thinking. And this is why virtually all EU programs insist on neoliberal principle, on a specific way of governance, specific way of market, specific way of economy. And I will end just with here briefly by just saying a few more things, that we should not confuse the instrument of aid, and that's the important message, or any economic instrument, with the generative structures that create and apply them. And that's, in this case, it is still imperialism, be it formal or informal. And that applies in the case of the EU relationship in the Middle East and the rest of the global South. So aid is embedded in this ideological and normative system that have constituted the perpetual transformation of the other as something essential for European security. They have to be always transformed, and so that becomes a permanent mission. And this way of thinking has been entrenching the difference between what is called Europe and what is called non-Europe in many ways, and whether it's culture, economics, and so on. And the effects are thoroughly destructive, and the gaps and the distinctions and inequalities are between Europe and the Middle East are growing and expanding by all measures. And that perpetuates in itself, by keeping this distinction and these gaps, the business of aid and the business of transformation, that is the colonial mission to transform the other constantly and keep them under the fold and under control. So I end here, and I think Jeremy might want to add a few more things. Thank you.
Thanks, Emile. I know we're short on time, so I'll try and be fast. And I appreciate, Daniela, that you automatically say my family name correctly. That's a rare instance now that I'm back in North America. It's usually Wildeman. It's Wildeman, as you said, or Wildeman. So I just wanted to mention too that it's interesting to have this gap in 3 years between writing the chapter. I can still visualize. When we wrote up this chapter, I'd go to a nice old church in Ottawa that's been turned into a cafe, and it was right before the pandemic. And you learn so much, and it's something Emile and we wrote our PhD thesis together in literally the same space. And Emile would make a good point that with age, and some of you are getting there with experience and age in the academic sphere, you learn and learn and learn, and it's going to be until the end of our lives before we probably feel really like proper scholars. But we're getting there, and this is part of that learning process, is how much you change over 3 years, but also how much you learn and you add. And so we're kind of adding thoughts to the chapter we wrote initially, and this is where Emile's going, like, what is that European broad relationship with the Middle East? And I'm just going to add a little bit of like sort of historical flavor to his comments, and a little bit of inspiration from Middle East courses I've been teaching in Canada, and even student feedback. So I just really have to emphasize, and something we kind of forget now because we've changed so much, is the former religiosity that Europe was imbued with, that it was a very Christian sort of entity made up of many, many separate states that were not anywhere close to unified like they are now, but rather always at war. And at the height of Europe's imperialism, it was driven by a colonial and mercantilist logics of exploitation and maximalist extraction of resources and wealth. So that's how the rest of the world was seen by at least the European governments, because the population is less educated back then and less involved in the political systems, of course, but definitely by the political sort of state at the time. And that logic was used to justify that system of exploitation. It was structured around racism, Christianity, and that was always at odds when you look at the history of Christianity and racism and colonialism, but those two were factors. And then the civilizing mission, where the colonized needs always to be dominated, to be reformed, endowed with the accoutrements of modernity, to catch them up to Europe, to be able to live on their own in civility, to become wealthy. And this was, of course, there's many, many famous authors you can refer to from that era, but Rudyard Kipling's famous white man's burden that many of us poke fun of. But as Emile pointed out, it kind of there's still a logic that exists to this day. And of course, this was a structural covering that Europe had, that sort of that civilizing mission, that white man's burden, for a rapacious exploitation of the global South. And one of the famous examples, a little bit off of the Middle East, but an important one, was India, which was really the heart of the British Empire. I mean, it accounted for much of Britain having an empire. And when you look at the period of British rule of India, the economy shrank by magnitudes, lifespans declined precipitously. There were mass and artificial famines. Actually, those trains that were built that are credited with the development of India were actually used to take food out of India and contributed to mass starvation. One economist, one famous figure is the Utsa Patnaik, and I'm sorry for butchering the name, who calculated that Britain drained a total of nearly $45 trillion from India during the period of 1765 to 1938. Just more thinking about this in less quantitative, more qualitative terms, India had been one of the sort of great economies, powerful societies, and manufacturing centers of the world, and it was plundered, and that economy was destroyed under British rule. And Europe didn't want to give up these colonies. This is something that's really important to remember. So the courses I've been teaching recently really look at the Middle East after World War II. And that's an important period because even despite the devastation of two wars that were interlinked with Europe's competition for colonies, one which the British famously fought to preserve their empire as much as their island nation, thinking back to the English, they continued to, those British continued to exploit wanted to continue to exploit about a quarter of the world for their benefit. And even France, after the devastating occupation in World War II, tried desperately to hold on to its colonial possessions. And the most very famous cases include Vietnam, of course, where they lost and the United States was drawn into a losing war that had major sort of effects on the United States as well. And most violently for France, its settler colony in Algeria, which at points threatened the stability of the French state. I mean, you almost had coups and military governments take over in France because of Algeria, because of this desire to hold on to Algeria. So there was a strong desire to dominate that sort of southern neighborhood right after World War II. In this period where we think of the liberalization, and maybe before I get to that, I'm sort of jumping ahead, I should even mention like the extent to which the Dutch violently tried to hold on to the Pacific holdings, Indonesia famously, and how the British and French invaded the Suez in 1956. Basically, the moment the Egyptians had full independence, the British and French invaded with a fake excuse created by getting Israel to invade and then pretending they were peacekeepers, but really just because they wanted to change the government to a friendly government that wouldn't threaten to nationalize the Suez Canal in order for Egypt to carry out proper development, in order to raise revenue, in order to lift the population up out of poverty. So there was always this sort of this struggle right after World War II to hold on to those territories. And it's really important to keep that in mind when thinking about the recent foundation. So there isn't just a colonial past like World War II, decolonization. Europe resisted giving up these lands. It almost really had to in the end, largely, there's a big factor is the Cold War and the competition in the Soviet Union and the United States not wanting Europe to have empires. And those refer, you could look at it from realpolitik hegemonic reasons, but also just when it comes down to it, the local populations, when you look at their history after World War II, largely their history after World War II is about anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism and this resistance to Europe. And there's sort of strongest resistance we end up seeing is that sort of wholesale rejection with the Muslim Brotherhood movement and political Islam, I should say, in general, which really takes hold in Iran in 1979. I'm not going to really get into that. I'm going to note also the interesting sort of historical inflection right now that the states that were most sort of comfortable with Europe, European sort of colonialism, the Gulf states, now are kind of flipping the script. Now they actually are influencing the West. They actually now have power over the West and are sort of pushing back in a way that sort of fits outside the framework of what Emile and I are discussing. This can fit with that sort of still that current European domination of the Middle East. And I know just because I'm short on time, I'm going to just mention, I'm just going to emphasize that because Europe became less Christian and more liberal in the 1960s, this did contribute to how you interact with your neighbors, and it can contribute to making it less acceptable to just dominate like you would in the imperial era. But there still is that asymmetrical relationship that Daniela, Professor Huber, I could say it, Daniela referred to, where Europe still dominates itself, and Emile sort of planted that sort of colonial structure, and then how it's just in many ways that language of Christianity and civilizing and proselytizing, that cover was replaced by liberal language because that is the current way that Europe organizes itself. So to still dominate its neighborhood, that more current language needs to be used. So we still see as this strain of domination of the neighbor, maybe not in explicit ways as militarily, but it happens. Like Libya was destroyed through military intervention for various reasons. And European companies are now involved in even competing with each other to plunder its resources. There still is that control, and aid is often used to reinforce that control. And that includes backing autocratic governments that do not represent the will of the people who generally the Arab Spring spirit is still there, that spirit for empowerment and democratization and local leadership, however that democracy looks like. But often because of that old racial logic where the the subaltern is treated as a constant threat, an excuse is created to always dominate and to reinforce these autocratic governments. And then that is done through aid. And so unfortunately, a lot of aid gets, from what would look like very sort of liberal, empowering purposes to sort of improve lives in the global south, that's that underlying priority of domination and security from the other in its most sort of vicious way, using the Mediterranean to create a violent space to keep people out of Europe, that difference in how you treat refugees from the Middle East versus Ukraine, that exists and still permeates that relationship between Europe and the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was the perfect lead over to our next author, which is Beste İşleyen. She will present the book chapter on migration and refugees in EU-Middle East relations, which she has, so Beste İşleyen is a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Amsterdam, and she has co-authored this book chapter with Tamirace Fakhoury, who is an associate professor of political science and global refugee and migration studies at the University of Aalborg in Copenhagen. Now, before I give the floor over to you, Beste, I just wanted to remind our audience, if you have questions, you can already put them into the Q&A box. Beste, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela, and thanks to the previous speakers. That was really, really interesting to listen to, which actually invites us to take history very seriously when we discuss EU-Middle East relations, which we with Tamirace also wanted to do in our chapter, which is entitled Migration and Refugees in the Middle East, but to a lesser extent than you guys. So our objective in this chapter was to give an overview of the main policies, practices, mechanisms, but also the main drivers of EU-Middle Eastern relations in the area of migration and border governance. And we specifically looked at the countries, two countries, Lebanon and Turkey. So my work in the last recent years has focused on Turkish border practices at European Union borders, whereas Tamirace has worked on EU relations with Lebanon in this policy area. So we sort of try to find commonalities, but as well as differences between the two cases, and also review the main debates in the literature when it comes to analyzing this particular policy area. So in that respect, we particularly focused on the concept of externalization, and I'm going to also elaborate on this a bit more. So, but at the same time, as I said, we need to take history into account, and most of the time we tend to focus on, recent events, and we tend to frame these events as being, unprecedented, exceptional, which never happened before. And we have these presentist accounts of migration and refugees in the relations between the EU and the Middle East. And this especially became prominent in 2015 and 2016, when almost 1 million Syrian refugees crossed from Turkey, especially onto the Greek islands to seek asylum. And during these events, we also saw that a very presentist discourse dominated the debates, calling these as being the worst refugee crisis since World War II, which of course excludes or disguises as similar refugee movements around the world between that time, between the Second World War and 2015 and 16. But at the same time, history also needs to be into account if we want to shed light on the long history of migration between the European Union and the Middle East, because this history is characterized by diversity in terms of migration dynamics, but also the related evolution of migration cooperation between the two continents. And of course, the chapter was about the EU and the Middle East, and it wasn't about Europe and the Middle East, because if we take Europe and the Middle East into account, we can give other examples which actually were very, let's say, let's say, at their time exceptional, such as the population transfer between Greece and Turkey, which covered 1.5 million people. That was a massive refugee moment. And in this chapter, we mainly focused on the EU aspect of these relations. And this historical overview also showed us that this migration dynamics already started in the 1960s and 1970s from the Maghreb and Turkey into Europe, and especially Western European countries. And back then, these migration flows were to meet labor demands, and they were therefore actively encouraged also by the countries in Western Europe. And this was followed by migration for family reunification purposes in the 1980s, during which Western European countries realized that the so-called guest workers were staying a bit longer, so family reunification became necessary. But it was also during the same decade that Southern European countries became destination countries, and migration started to become a security issue in Europe. And in that respect, we see that Spain was a very vocal actor in the 1990s to bring this to the attention of other European countries, trying to securitize migration, making it a security issue and a threat. So it was also during that time, at the end of the 1990s, that we see the European Union efforts to integrate migration into its external action and policies with regard to the Middle East. I said that there are some commonalities and differences between the two countries, Lebanon and Turkey, and this mainly relates to some of the terms that we also use when we teach EU-Middle East relations: association versus accession. Because in the case of Turkey, accession also is an important factor to determine the level, but also speed of reforms that Turkey undertakes in order to align its migration and asylum policies with the European Union. And this mainly operates within the framework of Turkey's adoption of the acquis communautaire, chapter 24, on security issues. Whereas in the case of Lebanon, relations are very deep and diverse. However, because no accession process is happening in the Lebanese case, relations in this area operate mainly through association. So, what are the main drivers of these relations in irregular migration management? Before coming to that, I would like to also maybe give you some background information about why these countries are so important for the European Union. These two countries are main refugee hosting countries, especially because of their geographical location, their close proximity to conflict in the Middle East, and therefore this is the main reason why Europe is very much interested in enhancing cooperation with Turkey and Lebanon as an external dimension of its migration policies. Maybe we can give some examples about the latest figures. For example, according to the latest figures published by the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, dated January 2019, Lebanon is the country hosting the largest number of refugees per capita. So Syrians constitute the highest number of refugees registered with the UNHCR, amounting to more than 950,000. So Lebanese government's estimations go even beyond these official numbers provided by the UNHCR. So the Lebanese government argued that these numbers have already reached 1.5 million. And we are talking about Syrian in that respect. And then this Syrian population is followed by Iraqis, who are the second largest number of refugees in Lebanon. And in the Turkish case, again, official figures estimates that the number of Syrian refugees are between 3.5 million, and the Turkish state argues that the number already reached more than 5 million. So this already shows why Europe is very much interested in deepening its cooperation with these two countries. So I also briefly mentioned that the main concept that is used to understand these relations is externalization, which is widely employed in academic studies to understand how these relations operate in terms of mechanisms, policies, and practices. So as I said, since the end of the 1990s, the European Union is interested in integrating border and migration management into the external dimension, into its external relations. And the main, of course, reason, the main rationale behind this is to enlarge the space and also transfer responsibilities for managing migration beyond the EU's external limits. So there are different ways in which externalization happens, and we also covered these in our chapter. One of them is more restrictive measures, which the EU utilizes to prevent migrants from reaching the European territorial space, both waters, but also land borders. But this is also supported by the more protective measures in which the EU also provides financial and technical health aid, in order to prevent the reasons for migrants to consider moving to Europe. So, for example, giving some financial aid to the refugee camps in Lebanon, or promoting policies in terms of labor integration of Syrians in Turkey, are mechanisms under which we call protective externalization, meaning that the idea is to reduce the reasons or incentives for people to migrate to the European Union. So this is also something that we see in other parts of the world. Australia, for example, is also very well known for its externalization policies. In that respect, I mean, there are of course some institutional drivers of the EU's interest in externalizing migration, but we see that this is a global trend. This is much bigger than the European Union. Mostly developed countries in the global south, the global north, are using these externalization measures for already 3 decades now in order to address migration in a preemptive way. And preemptive means that stopping the migration at the earliest point and at the remotest place as possible. And this requires the integration of third countries into migration control. And I also would like to maybe invite, also in cooperation, in line with what has been discussed by Emile and Jeremy about the colonial logics of externalization. We also there are also numerous studies which actually situate externalization into the wider history of colonialism and find some continuities between the racialized and colonized logics of managing space but ordering population groups. And externalization, therefore, is not exceptional, because when we talk about European policies, we always hear from the politicians or from the experts, that this is really innovative and that's a novelty in EU approach. But if you look at if you look at history, we see that there are a lot of continuities in devising certain policies, and migration management is one of them. And we have seen it also again. I mean, I do not want to, of course, measure or compare vulnerabilities of individuals, but we have seen with the Russian invasion of Ukraine that there was a differential treatment towards particular groups of population groups, and Ukrainians are refugees and they deserve full protection. But there was this criticism also that this kind of solidarity was not shown when people from Afghanistan or from Syria came. And this, again, I think, needs to be also considered in line with which population groups are considered to be belonging to Europe and who do not belong to this particular space. So I will leave it here, and maybe there will be more room for discussion afterwards. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Beste. In fact, there is a lot of food for discussion already here, but let's first turn to the third chapter and then open it up the discussion. So the third book chapter presented here is by Nora Aboushady and Chahir Zaki, which is titled Assessing EU-Middle East Trade Relations, Patterns, Policies and Imbalances. Nora Aboushady will present the chapter. She's assistant professor at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science at Cairo University and also research associate at the Economic Research Forum. And Chahir Zaki, who is the co-author, is Professor of Economics in the Faculty of Economics and Political Science at Cairo University. So Nora, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela, for the introduction. I just wanted to mention that for some technical reason, I'm unable to share my screen because it's disabled from the host. So I get the notification, host disabled participant screen sharing. I cannot hear you. Daniela, you're on mute.
Sorry, I muted myself. I will download the presentation and try if I can share it.
Okay.
Or if Marie maybe has it already, in case Marie wants to share. Otherwise, I just take 2 minutes.
I don't have it downloaded, but I can download it myself if you want.
Or if it's possible to enable somehow the screen sharing. I don't know who's the host.
Yes, right. Yes. Can you do it? I think you can do it now.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, good.
Perfect. I think you can see my screen now. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So as Daniela has already introduced the chapter, it's about assessing the EU-Middle East trade relations in terms of patterns, policies, and imbalances. So the objective of the chapter is actually to evaluate the EU-Middle East trade relations throughout the past 20 to 25 years, depending on the availability of data through or on 3 main levels. We first look at trade patterns at the country and sector levels to investigate whether the trade and economic integration has led to a promotion and diversification of the exports beyond the Arab countries' traditional exports, whether trade imbalances also between both shores of the Mediterranean exist or not. And we also look at trade policy and to which extent have there been structural changes in the trade and trade policy, and whether the trade policy imposed by Arab countries or used by Arab countries and also by the European Union contributed to a deeper integration, or whether integration is rather a shallow one. And finally, we look at some of the consequences or the imbalances at the socio-economic levels that were associated or that have accompanied the economic and trade integration, to see whether the Euro-Mediterranean partnership and the trade liberalization has fostered job creation, female employment, and contributed to other corrections of the socio-economic imbalances in Arab countries. In terms of country analysis, and of course based on the availability of data and the advanced state of negotiations and trade relations, we choose to focus on 4 Arab countries, which are 2 from the Mashrek, Egypt and Jordan, and 2 Maghreb countries, Morocco and Tunisia, that also have an advanced state of trade negotiations, because Morocco and Tunisia are, in fact, or have been for a number of years now, negotiating a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU. And we focus on our analysis on 3 main periods. The first is from 2000 to 2005, where most of the association agreements between the European Union and the Arab countries had entered into force. The second period is from 2006 to 2010, where the impact of these association agreements should have been tangible by that time. And also the Agadir Agreement, which is a South-South integration agreement, had entered into force in order to foster South-South integration and to foster trade between both shores of the Mediterranean. And finally, the period from 2011 to 2016-17 to see the repercussions of the Arab Spring on the trade relations between EU and the Arab countries or Middle East. The chapter is structured in 4 main parts. We first look at the historical overview of the trade relations, also from an institutional point of view, between the EU and Arab countries. And then we analyze the trade patterns, followed by an analysis of trade policies. And finally, we look at the socioeconomic imbalances and whether some of these were corrected or not. So I'm very briefly going to talk about the historical background. We know that the cooperation agreements on the economic side, there have been cooperation agreements between the European community in the 70s and the Arab countries, followed of course by the Barcelona process and the creation of the Euro-Mediterranean partnerships, which in its economic pillar included the conclusion of association agreements. Well, right now not with 10 of the Middle East countries, but actually we have a customs union with Turkey, and then there are 7 association agreements, and 2 countries, Palestine and Syria, have a less advanced state of negotiations. The overall objective was to create a free trade area between the EU and the South Mediterranean countries, or Arab countries. I think I'm going to use these terms interchangeably all the time by the end of 2011, and to expand, of course, the financial and technical assistance, targeting economic and trade policy reforms, and to help the countries overcome the adjustment costs that result from the liberalization. Financial assistance in the economic pillar was provided first under the umbrella of the MENA, Mesure d'accompagnement instrument, between 1995 and 2004, that mainly targeted structural adjustment and macroeconomic stabilization in the South Mediterranean countries, in addition to some support to the private sector and economic transition parallel to the liberalization process, some development projects in health, education, infrastructure, and so on, and some regional cooperation projects. The MENA instrument was then replaced by the European Neighbourhood Policy Instrument starting 2004, which includes additional aspects in order to foster deeper economic and trade integration. For example, there are discussions on and negotiations on including agriculture or specific agricultural sector, specific services, eliminating barriers to foreign direct investment and the movement of capital, and to harmonize the regulatory environment that affects trade, everything that relates to standards, accumulation of origin, conformity assessment, and so on, in order to foster trade and trade integration. So this is briefly what has been happening on the institutional side. We now look at the trade patterns, and we focus our analysis on these 3 main periods: the launch of the Barcelona process, or the entry into force later on of the association agreements, and then there where the tangible effects should have been taken place, and finally after the revolutions or the events of the Arab Spring. So here we're contrasting the importance or the relative importance of the Arab countries in the EU imports market to the importance of the EU as a major trading partner, or as a major partner or export destination for Arab countries. So if we look at the left side, we see that the share of Arab countries in the total EU's imports is minimal. And even though it has increased for countries like Egypt, or well, slightly for Morocco, there has been no tangible effect for Jordan or for Tunisia, but the share altogether does not even represent more than 1% of the total EU imports. And this has several reasons that I will be discussing later. And contrasted to that, the share of the EU as a trade partner for Arab countries is huge. So here we have the first disequilibrium or imbalance that we're looking at. For Egypt, for example, the share of the EU in its exports is around 30%, 70%, more than 70% for countries like Morocco and Tunisia, and less for Jordan, for which the EU is not the major trade partner, but rather the USA. But we can also see a downward trend or a decline in the share of the EU as a main trading partner to these countries, and this is related to some form of trade diversion from the EU as a major trade partner to other trade partners in developing countries, for which the exports or to which the exports are easier, because there are no restrictions in terms of conformity assessment, sanitary, phytosanitary measures, or let's say that these restrictions are less present or less stringent, which I will also discuss in detail later on. On the left side, we also see that the exports did not really increase, or the share of exports to total EU imports did not really increase, because also the business elite in the Arab countries have or have been maybe pressuring the government to be reluctant to liberalization in order to protect their own market, instead of using well, the agreement as an opportunity to explore new opportunities in the EU market. The structure of exports, of course, explains why the value of the Arab countries' exports is very minimal in the EU imports market. I took here just two examples, Egypt and Tunisia from the region, just to show that, for example, in Egypt, exports are chiefly concentrated in minerals and fuels, fertilizers. In the case of Tunisia, for example, we have articles of apparel and clothing, so that's either minerals and fuels or low value added sectors or traditional sectors like articles of apparel and clothing. While, for example, we see here that electrical machinery and equipment occupy a major share of the exports. However, it still represents a minimal share in the imports of the EU. So the structure of the exports have not really changed, and did not. This is an average throughout the 20 years, and it hasn't really changed well, considerably or significantly throughout this period. So we do not have a significant change in what the Arab countries export to the EU. Another reason for the stagnant patterns of trade is the trade policy. The creation of the free trade area meant the dismantlement of tariffs, which has happened. If we look at the left side, we see that Jordan, Tunisia, Egypt, and Morocco have significantly reduced the tariffs on the imports of manufactured products. And the same applies to a lesser extent on primary products, including agriculture, because of the protection of the local market. However, the non-tariff measures, which are other measures that act also as barriers to trade, like sanitary, phytosanitary measures, or technical barriers to trade, have been on the rise since the launch of the Barcelona process and the liberalization of trade, for several reasons, like protecting animal and plant and human health, making sure that the products, for example, exported by Arab countries are conform to the standards by the EU, but also to protect the local market. And this is used by all countries, not only by the EU, but also by the Arab countries. So in this figure, we contrast the share of exports to each export destination with the share of non-tariff measures that is imposed on by this market, by this export destination. And it's important to look at not only at the gray parts, which represent the EU, but also at the orange parts, which represent the general, the GAFTA, the Greater Arab Free Trade Area, which means the Arab countries of the South-South integration, so to say. So in the case of Egypt, for example, 39% of the exports go to the GAFTA, which imposes 52% of the non-tariff measures on the Egyptian exports. The same imbalance here, or maybe a larger gap, applies to the Tunisian case. So it means that despite the entry into force of the association agreements and the Agadir agreement, which should have fostered trade between countries, they use the non-tariff measures for reasons that are not well legitimate, so to say, just to protect, or maybe mostly to protect their domestic markets from the competition. And this also explains why, despite the possibility to accumulate the value added between the South Mediterranean countries and to export to the EU, there hasn't been really change in the trade patterns and the trade structure, because there is also limited integration between Arab countries themselves. Finally, we're looking at the socioeconomic implications, or also imbalances that accompany or that are associated with the liberalization. So we chose exports, and contrasting the exports with employment creation, because this is one of the main objectives of the free trade area, or of the partnership overall, to create an area of shared peace and prosperity, inclusion, leaving no one behind, giving opportunities to people in the South Mediterranean. So we're here contrasting exports and the growth rate of exports and employment throughout the three periods. And if we focus on the first two periods, we can see that exports were jobless exports, so to say. Exports increased to the EU, but were overall and to the EU, but were accompanied by a much less increase in employment. And this is because the Arab countries mainly focus their exports on capital intensive and not labor-intensive exports. In the third period, we can see that employment sometimes rose higher than exports in specific cases, for example, in the case of Egypt, but this is related to maybe employment creation in non-tradable sectors, so in the services sector or in employment programs that were implemented by the government, like public work programs and so on, but they were not directly related to exports, which of course were increasing very slowly during this period because of the repercussions of the political turbulence during that time and in the years that followed. Finally, we're looking at the gender gap, and in this table I'm showing you the male to female employment ratio by in the manufacturing sector and in the agriculture, and some striking examples come from Egypt and from Jordan in the manufacturing and agriculture, where the ratio of male to female employment is above, for example, in the case of Jordan, 19.7. And throughout the period of study, it does not seem that the EU-Middle East trade relations contributed to narrowing the gender gap in the manufacturing and the agricultural sector. Well, to conclude, I would like to say that Middle East trade relations represent a promising opportunity for Arab countries to increase their access to the EU market and to trade as well globally, of course, and to create more opportunities for export diversification, but also export upgrade along the value chain, and to benefit from the increase in trade for socio-economic objectives. However, several constraints still exist. First of all, trade patterns did not structurally change over time. The Arab countries export the same products, whether low value added products or traditional exports, with little productivity gains and little value creation. On the trade policy side, the tariff dismantlement did not really result into significant increase in trade. To the contrary, actually, trade to the EU has been decreasing in favor of other trade flows to developing countries and other trade partners for which exports are, or to which exports are easier, actually. And the trade integration and the trade policy remains shallow because there is a quasi absence of agriculture in the negotiations. Only selective sectors are allowed, and services, of course, are completely absent from the negotiations. And this is because either Arab countries want to protect their domestic markets, or the EU, there is a contrast between services liberalization and policies related to migration, for example. And finally, and this is one of the most important points, on the Arab side, there is a clear lack of industrial development strategies and diversification plans in the medium to long term. So if they themselves do not really explicitly know and tell what they want to do and how they want to diversify their economy and their exports, the EU assistance will remain fragmented and will remain focusing on some trade facilitation measures or some sectoral development in traditional sectors without really contributing to a long-term significant transformation, so to say. Thank you very much, and I will stop here. Happy to receive any questions.
Well, thanks so much to you, Nora, for this excellent presentation. And I think it shows how crucial it is to have economists on board when we discuss this relationship and the imbalance really in it. And indeed, I want to thank all four of you before we go to the question and answer for the excellent presentation and the excellent book chapters. It's really an honor for us three editors to have such distinguished academics on board, really. So let's move to question answers. I remind the audience that they can put it also directly in the Q&A box. Now, I have a first round of questions to the authors. So to Emile, because, or maybe I don't start with Emile because he just had to leave, I think. To Jeremy, I was thinking while you presented.
I'm not leaving. I just the blind where the sun was just rising. So
okay. Well, so yeah. I go back to you because my question,
sure.
Because you're based in Natolin also. And particularly in this period, I have been wondering indeed a lot about this question, how countries which we frame as Eastern European typically are situated in this kind of coloniality that you have been speaking about. Because I mean, the colonial powers have been Western European member states. Eastern European member states have been subject to imperial violence, both from Germany and from Russia, the Soviet Union, and now Russia. But at the same time, the Eastern European member states are now participating also in this kind of neocoloniality. Yeah, I mean, probably most obviously in the Polish participation in the US-led invasion of Iraq. So I was wondering, my question to you was a little bit about, what is their position in this context? And then, I don't know, shall I just go ahead, or do you want to directly respond?
Up to you, really. You're the boss.
Okay, good. So no, because I thought I just maybe come with questions that I had to everyone, and maybe you also want to respond of some of them. To Jeremy, while you were speaking, I was thinking more about this neoliberal side of this coloniality. And I thought in particular, what is a bit striking, I think, is that during the period of the Cold War, there was an important anti-colonial movement and struggle. And is it maybe more difficult to revolt against this current condition? Because maybe coloniality before, it was very clear whom to revolt against. I mean, there was a military presence, but whom do you revolt against now? And then my question to Beste. So one question is about Turkey. In particular, I would be interested to know how in Turkey this double standard of EU migration policy, on the one hand vis-a-vis Ukrainians, and on the other hand vis-a-vis Syrians, Iraqis, Afghans, which are crossing Turkey, is assessed. And I imagine there is discussion about this because elections are upcoming, and as far as I know, Erdogan has been quite contested on that issue. So, and also Turkey has, of course, as you described, been pushed into a certain position by the European Union on that. So I would be interested, what is actually the discussion in Turkey on this European approach right now? And then to Nora, speaking with officials from the European Commission, particularly during the pandemic, what came across was that they said, well, we want to strike two goals with one shot, which is that on the one hand, we have realized we are too dependent on China. And so we think this is a problem for us. So we would like to move the chain of production that is very essential for our market, for example, for antibiotics from China to countries such as Egypt, which are more dependent on us. So how do you assess this, and what effect do you think that could have on this kind of trade relationship? And the other questions I had for you was that the discourse in the European Commission, while there is unemployment in North Africa and the Middle East, is typically because of the so-called youth bulge, which kind of diverts the attention away from the structure of trade which you have presented to us, right? Because I mean, because the structure of trade does not really invest into sectors which could provide for employment in the Middle East and North Africa. And sorry, I forgot, there has also been a question by Michelle. I just tried to find it in the box, or do you want to, Michelle?
Yes, I can say it. Okay. First, I want to thank our excellent, not only chapter contributors, but for presenting here their further reflections on their contributions to the handbook. I found it very illuminating, so thank you to all. My question was very much to Emile's point, because you took us through some of the terminology that we still see today. And I'm interested in perhaps giving you the opportunity to elaborate a bit more on the idea that democratization is a colonial term. So if you could elaborate a bit more, that would be interesting, I think. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So let's go in speaking order. Thanks, Michelle. Emile.
All right.
Daniela,
thank you.
Emile, I'm really sorry.
You have to leave, Beste.
I'm sorry. I think I'm being kicked out.
Okay.
Okay. So if I may maybe take the floor.
Please.
I'm extremely sorry. Yeah. Thanks, Daniela, for the question. I think in the case of Turkish responses to the Ukrainians on the one hand and Syrian refugees and the EU's treatment, I think we need to differentiate between different groups in the Turkish society. So no society is monolithic. On the one hand, we have, the traditional media, which is very much tied to the regime right now, and their priority was not the Ukrainian refugees. Their priority was Turkey's geopolitical position in this war or in this invasion, and it was more about high politics. On the other hand, we of course have people, academics or activists who are working on asylum matters, and they were referring to the differential treatment by the European Union of Ukrainian refugees on the one hand and of the Syrians. So therefore, there were different, let's say, segments of the society, depending on their expert knowledge on the topic, but also depending on their relative interests. But you're right in pointing out that there is indeed a very, let's say, heated discussion in Turkey about the refugee population in the country, although Erdogan and the current regime were very receptive towards the Syrian refugees when the war started, and all over the years, they are now facing an opposition, and also considering the deteriorating economy and also rising inflation, the government is really to do something. And in fact, today in the news, there was this story that in order to maybe ease the tensions a little bit, and I think it was a performance by the regime, 178 Afghan nationals were deported. And you see the pictures of the plane and how these people were boarding on the plane and how they were being deported to Afghanistan. And we know that Afghanistan is not a safe place. So deporting them would mean that they are, they will be subject to immediate threat. So in that respect, we see that the regime is struggling. On the one hand, it wants to remain in power, but at the same time, there are these societal tensions arising. But also there are other groups like activists and academics who are trying to promote a more rights-based approach or rights-based discourse when it comes to the refugees. But it will definitely be a hot topic in the coming elections, and we will see much more heated debates in that respect.
Thanks a lot, Beste.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Emile?
Yeah, thank you for the questions, both of you. They're excellent. With regard to colonialism in Eastern Europe or Western Europe, whatever, I think we should first look at colonialism through take the long view of colonialism in order to understand that what happened in Eastern Europe is not necessarily the same type of colonialism that I was talking about. What happened in Europe, let's say the French invasion, the German invasion of Poland, and etc., that still is not based on the same thinking, the same system of thought of colonialism that started in what we call today America. It was called Aboushady in 1492. That's a totally different way of thinking, different system. It's a racial system. It's based on the distinction between white and white, between even questioning the humanity of these people, whether they are humans or non-humans, do they feel pain or don't, and so on and so forth. So the type of colonialism that started about 500 years ago, and I would go a bit further when it comes to the Middle East, let's say with the Crusaders and so on, is totally different than what happened between, let's say, Eastern and Western Europe. So it's I know it's coming now back to, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's more debate about this colonialism and so on in Europe, but it's totally is not the same. So we need to make that clear. We have here the system that was started, let's say, 500 years ago, still lives with us. We are all breathed, we all colonial subjects in a way or another, and every single day we just still behave colonially. And that's why we have all these concepts and ways of thinking. And that's what Europe managed to do during these 500 years. So what we ended up with today, we have coloniality. Even though colonialism, the way the direct one ended, we still have these patterns of power. That's what I was referring to as the matrix of power, that conditions the relationship today between what is called the West, the 12% of the world's population that's still in many ways controlling or dominating the 88%. So we have totally a different structure here. And that's why what happened during, let's say, World War I or World War II in Europe is still, it's kind of a feud within the same family, I would say. And Eastern Europeans, unfortunately, they wanted to be westernized in many ways, and we can see that in countries like Poland and elsewhere, even though I'm not based in Poland, I'm in Sweden at the moment. So anyway, so they participate in the EU's programs, and we saw that even a country like, let's say, Ukraine, unfortunately, it sent troops to Iraq. And even it's not still part of the EU, and it's just on the part of this side, it seems to be on the colonial system. And I don't think there is a comparison between what's happening or what happened in Eastern Europe and what happened in starting with South America, and then later on in the Middle East and Africa and so on. So there's a totally different structure of thought that organizes the relationship between these different spaces. If this is not clear, I would be happy to elaborate more. And democratization, why it's a colonial concept, that's an excellent question. And but this gets me into a totally different debate. Because first of all, I said something about transformation, and that's exactly what Europe tries to do, is transforming the system of values, the way people, their ethics, their beliefs, how they behave. And in the Arab and Islamic world, we need to understand that there's a totally different system of value where they derive their codes of behavior. And there where democracy comes in. It's not that the Arabs didn't know about democracy, they did. They read Plato and Aristotle before the Europeans anyway. So they know about democracy. But the way where they derive their codes of behavior is not through democracy, because democracy means that you are sovereign. The concept of sovereignty in the Arab thought is totally different than the concept of sovereignty in the European thought. In the Arab thought, you are not sovereign. Humans are not sovereign. It's Arab Islamic thought. In the Western thought, we think the human is sovereign, has domination over land, over the earth. That's not the case in the Arab Islamic thought. And that's where it comes democracy. The problem of democracy in that regard, the system is what the people, what the human, what that sovereign subject decides, what people, let's say in current modern system, let's say what the parliaments, what a bunch of people sit and decide the law and the regulation. That's not the case in the Arab world and the Arab Islamic world. There is an ethical system that is higher than the human, and the human is not a sovereign subject. It is higher than him, where you derive your like laws and regulations and so on and so forth. That's called the Sharia. So you have to go back to the sources in order to derive these important regulations or laws, or the way how you govern and the way how you run the economy and so on and so forth. Not through democracy. It's not what people sit down and decide and vote on, because sometimes you can take decisions that are not justifiable. I give you an example. We have democracy, but we take decisions that destroy the planet, because we conceived ourselves through the Enlightenment as sovereign subjects. So we have dominion over this planet. We decide what to do, and look the outcome that we have today. We have a climate change that threatens everyone. That's not the case in the Arabic Islamic way of thinking. Humans are not sovereign. They derive their laws from a higher moral system that's above them. So even that's why you have these debates still, even in the constitutions in lots of Arab countries, even after years of colonialism, Europe could not erase that part because it's so crucial in the way people behave, the way life is structured. You have the religion issue is still in every single constitution. That's the higher authority. It's beyond, it's higher than the parliament, it's higher than the leader or the president, whatever. And that's how things imagine the Arab Islamic society. There is the concept of al-ulama who used to derive all of these regulations, not the president, not the parliament, nothing of that stuff. That's why democracy in that way replaces the whole ethical structure on which the Arab culture, the Arab civilization, or whatever is based on. And that's at the moment, that's the core issue. Why I was saying democracy is really a colonial concept and used even colonially. That's the most important part. Actually, even when you go to specific policies, they don't really support democracy. Look at Tunisia. You have a perfectly democratized country after 2011. And well, we don't have, let's say, European support for that democracy to stand on its legs when it comes to, for example, the economy. Quite the opposite. So why, when you have a perfectly self-democratized country, it's not supported? Because democracy is just a cover for other interventions to transform more important stuff, to transform the humans themselves so they behave the way the EU wants, so they don't become themselves. And that's the most important part. That's how you get the colonized subject, all these colonized concepts that we use and we reuse all the time. And one of them is democracy. I'm not against democracy as such, but I'm explaining the complexity of this topic and why it's an issue on a bigger scheme, why it's a big issue. So you can't vote on something that is you can't have a democratic decision on something that is contradictory to the higher system of values of that culture. And that has been throughout Arab Islamic history since at least over 1,500 years. And the highest power to derive the laws were the ulama. And that was why exactly the attack on the ulama, and not only since the Ottoman Empire, when Europe started to intervene in the Arabic, in the Middle East, whatever. The attack was on what is called the endowment, the waqf, because that was financing an independent scholarship, an independent way of deriving these regulations and laws. That's exactly what was happening. So the first intervention was on destroying these independent resources, so you don't finance something equivalent to our, let's say, academy back then in that system. So I hope this explains why it has to do with that conception of who is sovereign, what is sovereignty, and what's the where do you derive your the highest moral or ethical system you are based on. And in that case, in the Arabic system is Sharia, and the Arabic Islamic system is Sharia, and that's exactly why democracy is a bit problematic in that regard. But there are ways around it. I mean, you can just elect a leader, but the leader can't decide set. They can't go out of that moral system. That's what I mean. I hope this explains.
Thanks, Emile. Michelle, do you want to respond or?
No, it's okay. I'll give space for more questions because we're running out of time.
Okay. So, Jeremy.
Yeah, and so it was an interesting question, Danielle, and I'm just going to add to Emile's point. So you saw after sort of the end of World War II, there's several responses to the West, and one of them that appears in force in 1979 in Iran, and the attempted siege on the Grand Mosque in Mecca, and just the growth of political Islam, which is an expression of what Emile is describing. I would point out and suggest, though, that it's not quite fully along that line, because there's a lot of comfort, I think, with neoliberalism amongst that community of political thought, and one of the sort of supporters of political ground were the merchants, right? And you can see it in Turkey as well, sort of the structure in Turkey right now. Even though Turkey hasn't went the way of Iran, you see some of the support for Erdogan looks similar to what the eventual government in 1979 of the competing factions that takes hold, their support base. So in a sense, they are kind of resisting that neoliberalism or liberalism in Western thought and looking for indigenous ways of thinking. You have then the two other sort of systems that were predominant, the Pan-Arab movement, the sort of Nasserists, the republics. They've been largely neutered, of course, through a combination of European and Western aid and shaping of their political systems, or in the case of Syria, for example, and Iraq, just utter devastation through intervention. And then you have the monarchies that were always most comfortable. And I would add Morocco to that monarchy. And I say Morocco because I know Emile's written about Morocco and colonialism that Morocco undertakes. And the monarchies that were in general more comfortable with the Western and sort of form of domination in the region, to the point where now you have, of course, quite famously, we see the Saudis and the Abraham Accords countries wanting the United States not to leave the United States as a real powerful sovereign in the region, to not leave the region, to not upset the status quo that they're comfortable with, to the point where they're interfering in the American political system by helping keep gas prices high, which will almost certainly contribute to Donald Trump or a preferred president coming back to power. So you have almost a reversal now of that colonial structure taking place, not quite there, but you have to be careful about your dependencies is one of the points I'm even leading to. So that, and I'm thinking too, when you talk about China, Egypt becoming a dependable production factory, let's say, on the southern shore instead of China. That was the assumption in the West, that China would just be that secondary market following the Western sovereigns and producing what the West needs. And then suddenly they flip the script and they are more advanced technologically in many areas, to the point where even some of their military equipment might be more advanced. So it's an interesting sort of inflection of history. But again, so like I'm just focusing on that neoliberalism point and that influence. It's particularly strong in those republics that sort of led that Arab independence wave after World War II. You do have the sort of struggles with political Islam, which those Gulf states are very concerned about, you can say, in their foreign policy and domestic policy. And then you have the Gulf states or the monarchies, so let's add Morocco, that have a particularly unique relationship with the West right now.
Thanks a lot, Jeremy. Nora?
Yes, Daniela, before answering the first question, could you just repeat the second one? Because I'm not sure I got it right.
Well, yeah, I mean, when I read the literature, or when I speak also with Commission officials on the issue of unemployment in the Arab world, which is quite high, the explanation they typically offer is that the reason for this is the youth bulge in the Arab world, the reason for unemployment. But I was thinking while listening to your lecture that one of the reasons might also be for unemployment, how trade is structured.
Yes.
Between the EU and the Arab world. Okay.
I'll probably answer both questions in one answer because they are interdependent in all cases. So the first question was relating to the nearshoring of the capital and the restructuring of the global value chains to become more of regional, maybe value chains, and how countries in the south of the Mediterranean, like Egypt, but also other countries like Tunisia and Morocco, for example, could benefit from such a thing. It's a huge opportunity, but there are considerations and there are preconditions, of course. So first of all, countries like Egypt, and then followed by Morocco and Tunisia and Jordan, had adopted investment facilitation frameworks, revised their the whole business regulations and investment regulations, issued lots of incentives and guarantees and everything to attract investment throughout the last maybe 20 or 15 years. However, there was no tangible effect on neither inclusion, neither inclusive growth or development, exports or employment. And this has to do with the structure of the production, which reflects as well in the structure of exports. That's first of all. They export either products that are of low value added, which hire unskilled labor, or highly capital intensive exports, like, for example, everything that's being extracted, oils, fuels, and so on. It doesn't only have to do with the internal structure, but also with the foreign investments, especially the EU investments in the region, which in Egypt, for example, are mainly concentrated in the oil sector. So if there is a partnership, maybe there should be more vision towards this inclusion, and this is included under the new I mean, under the new documents that are issued by the EU regarding the partnership. So it's not about attracting or giving guarantees and incentives and like tax reductions and exemptions and so on, because they've tried all of that and it hasn't really worked. There need to be some structural changes and structural transformations in the Arab economies themselves. For example, I mean, it's a huge opportunity, and when we write anything about, for example, global value chains, it's always written in the research that it's a good opportunity for other countries to benefit from the nearshoring of the capital. However, is the market ready to receive this capital and to respond to the needs of the EU in terms of technology, of course, in terms of the abundance of skilled labor? And this brings me to the question of the youth. There is a huge education labor market mismatch in the Arab world, which results also into a huge unemployment rate among the young people and among women, which are concentrated in informal sector with very low paid jobs and under very bad conditions. So concerning the medical sector, for example, if we want to attract the investments in the medical sector, do we have the staff? Do we have the skilled blue collar workers that are able actually to work in these factories? Do we have an equal competition in the internal market between public sector firms in all of North Africa? Despite the privatization and everything, there are still sectors that are heavily dominated by public sector firms. And there is no need to talk about their inefficiencies, of course, because they are mostly inefficient, but they dominate the market. And what is the role, what is the interaction between the public sector and the private sector? What is the role of the SMEs, of the small and medium enterprises, which employ over 90% of the total workforce in the Arab world, and which contribute to the exports and contribute to the overall production significantly? So how about these firms? Are they going to be encouraged to join the global value chains and to present their innovative solutions, for example? So how is really the market power here, and is the market welcoming of capital in a fairly or in an openly competitive framework? Also, according, for example, to enterprise surveys that are done by the World Bank every year or every few years, the investors in Egypt, whether domestic investors or foreign investors, and also in the rest of Arab countries, have mentioned, inefficient infrastructure, inefficient services, access to things like electricity, telecommunications, waters, the quality of the roads, for example, among the major constraints that hinder the investment and the development of other investment opportunities. Corruption and political instability are still, despite all these years past the Arab Spring, mentioned among the main issues that would discourage investors from entering the market or from expanding its operations in the market. So it's a good opportunity, providing that the market is welcoming of this opportunity. I think I may stop here for the sake of the time.
Well, thank you so much, Nora. And yes, indeed, we arrived to the end of this webinar. I think this has been an extremely important discussion, and I look forward to continue this with all of you. So let's definitely keep in touch. And I would also like to thank Deborah and Maria and Marie for the really excellent organization of all this. So thanks, and hope to meet you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.